Hello, welcome to a sexy episode of Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. I'm your sexy host, Robert. I'm sorry. I can't do it anymore. Hello, I'm Robert, the narrator, and thank you for joining me for Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. You may notice a slightly different setup for this episode, and I know gives a that opening gives a new meaning to the word frustrated, doesn't it? No, but yeah, it's a different setup here. I haven't done an episode in a while. I finally have some time to do an episode, and because of the way my home is set up, this is really the only way I could do it. So, more comfortable, relax, just sit back and relax, and we can talk about gaming and all of our favorite things. And I think I'll start this episode before this video gets reported to YouTube. But yeah, thank you for joining me for another episode. And this episode, I wanted to talk about a couple of player issues or strategies or tactics that have at one point or another in my career in the hobby has maybe detracted a little bit from the fun, or maybe I could say it made me come up with a couple of tips and tricks as to how to handle them. And I just wanted to talk about those and was wondering if any of my fellow hobbyists out there have come across these same issues. So I think the first thing I'm going to talk about is probably more on the player issue side of things. And that issue is what I like to call working the referee. And the term comes from athletics or sports, where an athlete will try to plead their case to the rules official, referee, or umpire to get an advantage over their opponent. And I have seen that happen in my games. Can't say that I've ever seen it in other players' games, but it has happened to me. And when I say working the referee, this is what I mean. I have had instances where my players have stepped out of character to plead their case that they wish the NPCs would act in a different fashion, or that the way that the NPCs were responding to their tactics were unrealistic. Either they thought, mostly it's they wanted the NPCs, they thought that the NPC should surrender, giving their overwhelming, the players' overwhelming prowess and capabilities. They thought it was unrealistic that the NPCs would continue fighting. And I've had this happen to me before. It's a fairly easy fix. And I wonder if anyone else out there has ever come across this issue. For instance, one time that this happened is during a game of Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars Edge of the Empire. And essentially the setup was the PCs were sent on a mission to collect money from the business or operation of one of their benefactors. And when they arrived, they decided to take all of the money from the business and not let their benefactor know, give him what he thought he should have, and keep the rest, leaving the business in a very precarious situation. And of course, it's Edge of the Empire, so the PCs were mercenaries armed to the teeth, and the individuals operating their benefactor's business or operation were not. And the NPCs, the business wasn't going well. They had just got out of a really dangerous situation. So the NPCs were angered, and they were going to be left without the funds they needed to run their business. So they decided that they were going to take up arms against the very well-armed PCs. And the PCs thought that in that circumstance, the NPCs should not have taken up arms, and they were being a little too aggressive. And given the piece that the PC's firepower, they thought that the NPCs should not have been so hell bent on trying to stop them. And of course, this was a published adventure, and the adventure said even if the PCs are better armed, the NPCs will attack. The odds against them even, unless the PCs can persuade them otherwise, even if the PCs were willing to show force. So that's what I had them do, and the PCs, I don't think they would act like that, and they stepped out of character and started to plead their case, work the referee, if you will, that the NPCs would not act in that fashion. And this is something that has happened several times. Usually what you may find, if you have ever come across this, is whenever the PCs are being bullies and are being greedy and are being murder hobos, and they want to steal from people who don't deserve to be stolen from, or they want to treat NPCs poorly who don't deserve to be treated poorly, if the NPCs don't immediately back down and give the PCs the feel goods, not so feel bads for robbing them blind, the PCs will, at least this is what I have noticed, they will start pleading to have the NPCs act more passively, so that the PCs won't feel so bad for being murder hobos. That's when it has normally come up. And this is my fix for this particular player issue. And my fix is that my response to requests to change the NPC's response to a PC's tactics is, if you would like the NPC's response to your tactics to be different, change your tactics. I have personally never accepted the idea of PCs stepping out of character and trying to metagame or trying to mitigate the response to what they're doing outside of their character, because I love role playing, and I love portraying characters and getting into their heads and getting into their backgrounds and their motivations and beliefs. So whenever I portray an NPC, I always figure out what makes them tick and have them act appropriately. So when they respond to a PC's tactics, they're responding based on their beliefs and their background and so forth. So there is no need for me to adjust their response. Their response is based on their personality. But what can change the NPC's response is the PCs changing their tactics. And if you have ever come across a situation where a player character wants to step out of character and attempt to work you over as the game master or dungeon master, and try to get around the obstacle of the NPCs by having you change the NPC's response, I would say that is probably the best way to respond, is to say, hey, if you want the NPC's response to your tactics to change your tactics. And I think that's a pretty straightforward and easy way to avoid being worked over by the players. Another not so clear-cut player strategy or tactic that I have seen is when NPCs have a drop on the PC, and then instantaneously the player character wasn't aware of their surroundings or where they were, or they claim to have been unclear on where they were positioning, and they begin to dispute where they were. And that's something that is a little bit unclear, especially if you're not using a map out of the encounter or the scene. I guess there's a lot of room for error and a room for misunderstanding. But sometimes I think that the misunderstanding of everyone's positioning can sometimes be used as a tactic to, again, mitigate the advantage that NPCs may have on the PCs. So that's also something of a player issue or tactical strategy that I've seen my players try to use against me. That, again, is not as clear cut as working the referee, because especially if you're not using a map where everyone's position is precisely kept, there's room for confusion. So really the only fix for that is to be as precise as possible with your describing your encounters and your scenes, to make sure that everyone understands where they are, where the bad guys are, or at least where the bad guys are coming from when they do spring their trap, so that you don't get that other style of being worked over by the player characters of all of a sudden I didn't understand where I was now that I know that I'm under attack. So that's something else to to watch out for. So that kind of falls under the player issue things that I've seen as a game master. So what else did I want to talk about? I also wanted to talk about another, I guess, player issue also, and what I call it is complexity blaming. So I'll explain what complexity blaming is, and I think I'll start this way. There are very few games, RPGs out there that I know of, that cannot be played by just using the core task resolution mechanic, which is usually rolling a die, adding a number to it, rolling a die, comparing it to a target number, rolling a bunch of die and counting successes. And I really can't, right now I'm thinking about it, and I've tried to think about it before this episode, of games that can't be played, for instance, when you're using skills or when you're attacking, by just using the core mechanic and really not having to interact with the game on any other level other than understanding the core task resolution mechanic. So that's where this whole idea of the complexity blaming starts. Tell me in the comments below if you've ever come across this. There are players who like really rules light games, who either don't have a taste for or really can't understand games that are more complex than, say, rules light. And they really should have a really easy system and really should only interact with the core task resolution mechanics. But when some of those players play games that are more complex than a rules light game, they attempt to interact with the complexities of the game, and I would say unnecessarily, because as I said, most games can totally be successfully played by just using the core task resolution mechanic, and they try to interact with the more complex concepts of the game and become unsatisfied with the game, and then they blame the game or the game master because the game is too complex. Have you ever seen that before? I have, and it is very funny to me. Well, not funny, but it's I can't say baffling either. It's just interesting. I have seen complexity blaming a great deal in the games that I've played, and I guess I have a tip or trick for it, because I understand where that comes from, at least the part that makes a player who really wants a super rules light experience to try to dabble in the higher activities or complexities or mechanics in the game. It's quite simple. They see other players being successful and doing tricks and cool things and having fun with the more complex concepts of the game. And quite frankly, when you see someone else having fun, what do you want to do? You want to have fun too. You want to be successful. You want to be cool and get in there and have a really good time. So it's just human nature, even though it may be over your head. The part that I don't understand is the part where once the player realizes that they're in over their head and they have opted into a level of the game that's not necessary, but they want to because everyone else is opting into it. The part that I don't understand is when they blame I guess I do. No one really wants to ever blame themselves. So I understand it, but it's always interesting and funny to me when they then blame the game or the game master. Many of my games have been deemed as too convoluted when they could easily be played using the core task resolution mechanic and only that, and players try to interact with the rest of the game and then deem the game too complex. So the really the fix for that is, to be quite honest with you, is to only run games that I guess will not entice players to try to interact with or opt into higher complexities. To have a game like something like maybe Faith. The core task, the task resolution mechanic is pretty much all the same, and everyone pretty much can function in the game by using the core mechanic without too many other complexities added on. And that of course, that depends on what version of Fate you're playing. But yeah, that really is the only, if you are going to run a game that's slightly more complex, to be open upfront about what else is out there beyond the player's comfort level and to try to ease them into it. So that really is the only fix for that. So complexity blaming and working the referee and ignorance on the battlefield situation when the NPCs are getting the drop. Have you ever experienced those player issues? And if so, please let me know in the description below. Thank you very much for joining me for another episode of Confessions of a Frustrated Game Master. Good morning or good evening, wherever you are.